Hello, everybody. Welcome to our IGRI seminar. We're very excited to have Ute Brady, the IGRI lab manager, presenting today. She's going to be presenting a paper called Regulative Monitoring and Enforcement Institutional Design in International Conservation Governance, a comparison across 4 treaty regimes. A couple quick reminders before I turn it over to Ute. One is that our deadline for submitting abstracts for the IGRI inaugural conference is today. So if you haven't yet had an opportunity to submit an abstract for the conference, but you would like to present, which we hope you will be interested in, please try to get in your abstracts today. And if there's some issue that's preventing you, or you're hearing about the conference for the first time today and now it's interested you, if you want to even just shoot us an email to say abstract coming, that would be great. And the one other quick announcement is that we are changing time to better accommodate our European colleagues in particular, but our colleagues from around the world, hopefully. Starting in July, our IGRI seminar will move from Fridays at noon to Tuesdays at noon. So we hope that this is a little bit more desirable, at least again, so that our European colleagues don't have to spend their Friday nights with us. So, all right, well, without any further ado, Ute, we are looking forward to your presentation.
Hey, thank you. Let me share my screen. And you should be able to see my presentation, is that right? Okay, yeah, perfect. And you can hear me okay? All right. Let's get started then. So thank you for the introduction, Saba, and thank you everyone for your interest in my presentation. So as Saba already mentioned, this is a tiny bit of my dissertation that I'm going to be presenting on. And I had prepared to say something about it, but I guess I can just skip over that now if I can figure out how to move forward here. There we go. Okay, so I think I'm preaching to the choir here when I say formal rules matter, but it bears repeating because the formal rules really do provide the foundational decision-making context of a particular governance regime. And if you don't know what this says, you don't know what these guys are doing. And ultimately, conservation outcomes, especially in conservation regimes, conservation outcomes can't be fully assessed either. I would be remiss to ignore the fact that formal rules have been analyzed in great length and depth. So there's been, they've examined national policies relating to transportation, smoking bans, health, regional agreements that deal with watershed agreements. So there's been many studies on formal institutional design. However, interestingly, there's only a few studies that have actually looked at the design components of international institutions, and some of those looked at the design principles of tuna fisheries and the Montreal Protocol. And I'd obviously be remiss in talking about Ronald Mitchell's work at the University of Oregon, where they've engaged in a long-standing effort to catalog the general characteristics of international environmental agreements. But again, they're looking at identifying and coding the goals, requirements, and any measurement indicators outlined in treaty documents. So really, there aren't any studies that have analyzed the institutional statements of international instruments in general and their monitoring and enforcement mechanisms in a global conservation context in particular. So that's kind of the research gap that I'm trying to address with my own studies. So my research views global wildlife and biodiversity as a common pool or CPR resource because it's rival and largely non-excludable. Animals obviously don't care about national borders. They don't carry passports, and they really don't care where they wander off in search of food or a mate. And so that creates transboundary issues if you have countries that spend a lot of time and money conserving certain species and then they saunter over the border and get shot. That is a governance challenge, specifically over appropriation, and generally a resolution mechanism to such transboundary issues, international collective action, but in particular behavior standardization, often through regulation or incentives, privatization. I'm obviously not going to be talking about privatization, but the other two. So what I've often been asked is, why do we even care about this? I mean, I can go to the mall, and once the pandemic's over, I can resume my social life. What do I care about biodiversity? Well, there's, I think, 3 reasons why we should care. The first one is from an institutional analyst, policy designer perspective. So improving our knowledge of the institutional design of international instruments is an important piece of the policy design puzzle. And so, as I mentioned, linking de jure with de facto and policy outcomes to better understand these connections. And also from a academic perspective, there's a particular need to focus on institutional analysis of international instruments, because especially in the wake of increasingly devastating reports on accelerating declines in global biodiversity and species extinctions. So we need to determine whether these instruments, which have been around for a long time, are actually inherently designed to meet contemporary conservation challenges. And then finally, from an ethical or an activist perspective, which is frankly where I come from, whether one believes non-humans have intrinsic value, you should selfishly care about biodiversity, because the ecosystem services that they provide cannot be easily duplicated, and it's been researched that losing species will result in serious ecological, economic, and social consequences for us. So be selfish and care. So, of course, nation states have recognized these transboundary issues and the need for global collective action for quite a while now. And over the course of the past century, several conservation treaties were negotiated to mitigate these issues. And they have been examined by IGRI in international relations and legal scholars. They're deemed critical to averting biodiversity and species declines, and they are central components of these strategies to link global conservation actions together. And so these are the 4 that I've included in my study. We have the International Convention on the Regulation of Whaling. They refer to themselves by their governing body, the Whaling Commission, but I'm going to call it the ICRW, or just the Whaling Convention. Then we have the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES. We have the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, and then the Convention on Migratory Species, the CMS. So those are the ones I'm going to focus on. I'll talk about them in more depth in a minute. So my study focuses specifically on institutional statements dealing with monitoring and enforcement or compliance, as well as monitoring and sanctioning of opt-outs. And that's because opt-outs have the potential to undermine treaty objectives. So the literature tells me that monitoring and enforcement are powerful antidotes to CPR appropriation dilemmas, because they increase knowledge about actor behavior, so what's going on over here, and resource conditions. How many bears like scratching this tree, and how many of them are there in the forest? And they also signal that deviations from the rules will be punished. So what's really interesting about at the international jurisdictional level is that monitoring and enforcement provisions actually represent endogenous institutions that are designed to compensate for the lack of an overarching authority and external enforcement body. So they're designed, or they should be designed, to generate review, oversight, and information sharing functions to ensure that appropriation behavior meets agreed upon standards, and then non-cooperators are punished. And down here, this is just an example of an opt-out. So these countries eventually filed objections or opt-outs against ivory trade. Just as a side note, we'll get into that more in a little bit. So my research is informed by collective action theory. And again, I don't have to tell you very much about collective action theory. I'm sure everybody's familiar with it. So just substitute states for individuals, rational actors, and having a common interest in addressing global biodiversity and ideally willing to collaborate collectively to mitigate these dilemmas. And of course, we know that's all kumbaya, and collective action can be thwarted by strategies that favor short-term benefits. In the case of states, it's often political and economic. So in the literature, monitoring enforcement has been found to be critical to effective resource governance at all levels. Scholars have found that coupled monitoring and enforcement mechanisms are crucial to the effective implementation and concomitant benefits from cooperation. Obviously, monitoring increases transparency and exposes defectors, which you need if you want to enforce. And sanctions also raise the costs of shirking and make non-compliance ideally less desirable. And then our Common Pool scholars have really found that effective monitoring and sanctioning arrangements can mitigate collective action dilemmas. Now, at the international level, specifically, monitoring has been found to improve rule compliance and rule following commitment by member states, and it also fosters the standardization of behavior and actions that you really need if you're starting to or coordinate global conservation efforts. Now, opt-outs, such as basically are escape clauses, and I want to just spend a minute on them because you might not be familiar with them. So these are escape clauses that reduce the political uncertainty that state representatives face when committing to the terms of a treaty, but also to resolutions that are passed as contemporary decision-making occurs. And so basically what that means is the conservation treaties organize species conservation efforts by assessing the threat level to a particular species and then assigning them into either appendices or a schedule in the case of the Whaling Convention. And so placing a species in an appendix triggers a set of rules that tell member states what and what cannot be done with that species. So if it's endangered, likely trade is going to be very limited, if at all. And so opt-outs are designed to make the treaty ratification more likely and also to keep parties at the table. So you basically allow a country like a South African country to opt out of the listing of elephants in Appendix 1 with no trade by filing an objection that keeps them at the table, but it removes them. So for that species, they're suddenly not a member state anymore, they're a non-member, and the rules do not apply to them. So the trade-off here is, so you get to keep them as member states, which you want. You want everybody who has species at the table. But you also have to extract the cost to do so. Because if you don't, if the cost isn't sufficiently high, then there's a risk that there's an excessive use of these opt-outs, and that kind of can undermine, as you can imagine with species, can undermine any conservation efforts. So that's why I'm including looking at opt-outs in my study. Now, the analytical tools I use to answer my research question is basically institutional analysis, looking at institutional statements and characterizing them using the institutional grammar, 1.0, not 2.0, sorry. So basically, why the institutional grammar? Because it allows me to disassemble the institutional statements into their core syntactic elements. It's embedded in the logic of the IAD, and it's a very structured method that you can use to analyze text in a similar manner, and it facilitates cross comparisons. And then obviously, I use the rule typology, which is also embedded in the IAD framework, to then look at the statement level and see what 7 generic rule types may be influencing actors and actions within a given action situation. And action situation at the international level would be the conference of the parties, where they get together and make decisions every 2 or 3 years. Then finally, I also looked at, in addition to that, I also looked at stringency for an institutional design based on the Deontic in the institutional grammar. And here the theory is that institutional design that favors governing behavior through mandatory rights and obligations over recommendations is thought to facilitate rule compliance and ability to reach core treaty objectives. And that's because if you're telling someone that something is mandatory, you better specifically describe what kind of an action is mandatory and not leave it up to guesswork, otherwise you can't enforce your rules. So generally, increased stringency is associated with greater specificity of prescribed actions, and that means more likelihood that they'll do what you want them to do. Again, this is all theory, formal institutional design. Redundancy and modularity and diversity I borrowed from robust institutional design, although I'm not doing a robustness analysis. So with redundancy, I'm basically looking at how many institutional statements does each treaty devote to MOEs, so monitoring, opt-out, and enforcement mechanisms. With the theory being if there's more institutional statements for monitoring, if you have 20 statements that deal with monitoring and you lose 3, you still have enough left. That's kind of the theory. And in contrast, modularity is looking at modular design. So in the treaty context, that would be the rule types. So how many different rule types do they use to craft these monitoring and enforcement mechanisms? And again, the theory is that if there's more of them, if one of them malfunctions or is tinkered with, it's not going to affect the overall institutional framework. And diversity, finally, I'm just looking at the number of actors that are, so looking at the attribute, the number of actors involved. And again, systems with high diversity, so a large number of actors, have been found to generate more new ideas, components, or connections. So that again is associated more with robustness, the ability to withstand change. Now, my research question is pretty simple. It wasn't always, but it is now. So how is monitoring and enforcement described or structured in the design of international conservation treaties? And the method that I use is a descriptive comparative analysis for international conservation treaties using the grammar and the IAD rule typologies. So not a lot of bells and whistles here. It's pretty simple. So let's talk a little bit about the treaties that I included in my analysis. So one of the reasons I selected the 4 that I have is because they kind of represent a microcosm of international conservation governance regimes that emerged during the last century. And they include the following characteristics. So they're all in scope, they're all considered multilateral environmental agreements, which is a fancy way of saying they're a treaty. And it basically means that they have at least 3 member states that have ratified the treaty. They are also have similar conservation objectives. So the conservation objectives are conservation for sustainable use. So here we're looking at, in the Whaling Convention, we're looking at whales. CITES looks at the regulation of international wildlife trade, not domestic. CMS looks at migratory species conservation. And then the CBD takes a broad approach and looks at biodiversity in general. And then they also have similar ways, ways to govern at the international level. So they have governing bodies. In the Whaling Convention, it's the Commission, and then it's the Conference of the Parties in the other 3 treaties, which basically these bodies consist of representatives from each of the member states, and they all get 1 vote to make a decision. Now, there's also interesting differences. Age is one of them. The Whaling Convention has been around for over 70 years, and the CBD is just approaching 30 years in existence. There are organizations, so these 3 are organized under the United Nations. And the Whaling Convention is not, and that's because when it was ratified, the UN was just being formed. And so they decided subsequently not to reorganize as a UN treaty. And then finally, the member states. So the Whaling Convention has the fewest member states, and the CBD has near universal coverage. So there's only 2 countries in the world that are not parties to the CBD. And yes, you guessed it, the US is one of them. And we're joined by the Holy See. How's that for starters? So document selection. Basically, what I did is I coded a lot of documents, but included in this particular analysis are only those that contain MOEs, the monitoring, opt-out, and enforcement statements. So there was a total of 45 documents, and here's the spread by treaty. And if you're thinking, wait a minute, Ute, why are you being so lazy here? It's because there's not that much going on in the CMS and the Whaling Convention. For the Whaling Convention, when they have commission meetings, they pass maybe 2 or 3 resolutions versus 50 or 60 in CITES, but that's also driven by the scope of their work, right? So here we're just looking at whaling activity, and there's a moratorium on whaling generally. So there's not that much, there are issues, but there's not that much going on. Whereas international trade in wildlife is much bigger of an issue. But then if you look at the institutional statements that deal with MOEs, there's a much more equal spread there. So I have a total of 1,195 institutional statements. And I should probably briefly just describe that there's 2 different types of documents in treaties. So you have foundational documents, which like the convention text, which basically outline, bring the treaty into existence and also outline the commitments that the parties make that join. And then you have resolutions, which are the contemporary decision-making processes. So these are the decisions they make on species listing, finances at each of the meetings where they get together. So that's biannually or triannually. And generally, foundational documents are mandatory, legally binding. They're considered mandatory, legally binding, versus resolutions are more recommendations, but there's a mix of both in institutional statements in both documents. So this representation is just basically a pre-processing of the documents and identification, how I identify institutional statement types. If you've ever coded IG, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but real quick, you have a document, you copy it into a spreadsheet, you split it up by institutional statements, you code each institutional statements, and then you look at the aim, but also the context, to do a rule identification based on the action situation, so these rule types. And I only selected 1 per statement. And then I looked at the statements to see whether they contributed to MOE, monitoring, opt-out, or enforcement. If they didn't, they weren't included in this analysis. And this is just a quick sample statement. So you have the institutional statement here. The aim here is maintain. Now that's not necessarily an aim that's affiliated with an information rule, but if you look at the context, maintain records of trade. So here we're trying to gather information. So this would be coded as an information rule, contributing to monitoring, because we're creating records of trade that can then help with monitoring efforts. And so for my analysis, I looked at aims, I looked at Deontics, and I looked at attributes. All right, so how did I go about measuring these? Stringency, again, looking at the Deontic operator with a particular focus on the MLB, mandatory legally binding Deontics, which at the treaty level are shall and must. And then looking at redundancy, I just basically counted the number of regulative statements outlining MOE activities in each regime. And then modularity, I basically looked at how many different rule types were utilized to craft MOEs. And diversity was counting the attributes or actors involved in specific MOE activities, and also the actors that were involved in all 3. Okay, so there were 3 broad institutional design patterns that differentiated these regimes from each other. The first one was separating kind of the design of the MOEs in the Whaling Convention from the UN organized treaties. And so the first thing that you'll notice here is that there's a whole heck of a lot more payoff rules in the Whaling Convention than there are in the other 3. Now, payoff rules basically outline or link sanctions and incentives to particular actions or outcomes. And so 72 of these 74 payoff rules or institutional statements are actually found in the convention schedule. Now the Whaling Convention is a lot like a fisheries agreement. It's sad to say that, but that's what it is. And the schedule basically outlines whale species, harvesting quotas, because there's still subsistence whaling going on. And so you have statements in there that basically say the number of bowhead whales landed shall not exceed 392, and factory ships and whale catchers are forbidden from entering certain waters in the pursuit of bowhead whales. And so that's what this is, really specific guidance as to what whaling activity can be done by whom. And you can see here that another interesting thing about the Whaling Convention is it doesn't have any scope rules in the MOE. And so scope rules basically outline performance or outcome measures or targets that actors have to meet, but then actors can decide how they meet those targets. The Whaling Convention is not interested in outcomes at all, but they take on increasing significance in the UN treaties. So that's the first differentiation. The second one is CITES and the Whaling Convention kind of differentiate themselves from CMS and the CBD. And so what I mean with that is, first of all, they use, in general, the number and percentage of overall statements devoted to MOE are much higher in the Whaling Convention and CITES than in the others. And then additionally, information rules are deployed in greater numbers than in the other ones, in the other two treaties. And so information rules are really crucial because they give you information on the functioning of the situation. They give you insights on appropriation and on species population levels. So they are kind of the heart of these treaty design. So, and there's a greater emphasis here in these treaties than in the others. And so examples of information rules in the Whaling Convention and CITES include contracting parties are required to transmit harvesting and infraction data to the Commission. That's in the Whaling Convention. And then in CITES, parties are required to transmit data, maintain and report records of trade in all CITES listed species. And compare that to the CBD, where in the CBD and the CMS, information rules rather provide guidelines, for example, to catalog components of biological diversity or reporting migratory species that the parties think are within their range. So you have regulatory oversight, information rules that focus on regulatory oversight, and you have in the CMS and CBD kind of more like a voluntary information sharing use of the information rules. So that's the difference there. And then CITES sets itself apart from all the other regimes because, well, first of all regimes use aggregation information and choice rules to craft their MOEs. But in CITES, the yellow arrows here, these occur in much higher numbers than in the other ones. And CITES MOE also emphasizes the use of aggregation rules much more than the others. So aggregation rules outline how participants are related in decision-making. It's also, they outline the hierarchy of reporting in institutional regimes. So there's a much higher focus on those elements in CITES than in the other ones. And so in general, CITES MOE mechanisms are much more well developed than in the other three treaty regimes. And so I know this is a little bit hard to see, but I'll kind of guide you through it. So basically, looking at the overall MOE institutional design by activity. So monitoring, the first thing that you notice here. So first of all, this blue this is CITES. No, I'm sorry, this is the Whaling Convention, CITES, CMS, CBD, and these are the rules. So you can see that monitoring is driven by aggregation, information, and choice rules with varying numbers of institutional statements used. But that's something that's consistent across all of these regimes. Now the opt-out mechanisms, and we have to drop CBD. CBD has one rule related to opt-outs, and that basically says we don't have any. So that's it. Sorry, and where is that one rule? I don't even know. Here it is, the boundary rule. So boundary rules are basically the rules that outline that the parties are now switching. So when they file a reservation, it's basically a boundary rule because now the other parties are instructed to view this particular country as a non-member with regard to the species under reservation. If that makes any sense. So that's where these boundary rules come in. Now, the Whaling Convention uses boundary aggregation, information, and choice to govern its opt-out activities. CITES uses boundary, information, and choice. And then CMS uses boundary and one tiny information rule. That's it. That's it. So it gets fewer and fewer. Looking at enforcement, that's what really gets interesting. So choice rules kind of dominate in the UN treaties for enforcement activities, which is kind of like, choice rules for enforcement, okay. But here in the Whaling Convention, here are these payoff rules. So they really focus enforcement on payoff rules. And we'll get into this selection of choice rules in a little bit in a discussion in just a minute. So that's the composition of rule typologies with regard to the activities. Now, stringency. I should probably mention when I first started coding all of the documents, I noticed that the percentage and number of mandatory legally binding Deontics was similar across all 4 regimes. And that was such a puzzle because it didn't make sense. According to the literature, and if you talk to people in the regimes, there is not a person that you will find that will say the CBD has mandatory legally binding commitments on its parties. It doesn't. So I'm like, so why do they have all these shells, but they're not mandatory and legally binding? So what I found was that there are certain aims and when conditions that dilute the shall in the mandatory legally binding nature of the shall. And what I mean with that, so examples of an aim, diluting aim would be endeavor to do something. And an example of a when condition that dilutes is as far as possible and as appropriate. So you tack that on, let me give you an example from the CMS. So the CMS convention says that the parties shall endeavor to provide immediate protection to endangered migratory species. And now compare that to the parties shall provide immediate protection to endangered species. That's an action. But when I'm endeavoring to do something, that's not an action anymore. That's a recommendation. I mean, I can sit here and endeavor to do something. It's not going to change anything. But how do you enforce that? How do you enforce that if it's a rule that you basically cannot break? So basically what these diluting whens and aims do is they reduce the mandatory nature of a shall to that of a should, so a recommendation, but they also switch an action, so a choice rule, into a scope rule, because it's not an action anymore, it's an outcome. And so if you look at the number of statements in these designated mandatory legally binding, first of all, these 2 treaties have much more, but then of the 93 that the CBD has, 27 of them are watered down or diluted. So there's not much mandatory legally binding going on. So that again is in line with the literature. So basically what I determined was that the Whaling Convention and CITES are highly stringent, so they have a lot of commitments that they place on their parties. CMS moderately and CBD weakly stringent. And again, stringency is important because it's also an indicator of how specific are the requirements on the parties. Now, looking at redundancy, there's not much to say. Again, just counting the institutional statements, as I've already mentioned, the Whaling Convention and CITES use many more statements to craft their MOEs than the other 2. Modularity is, they were very similar from their modular design. So the Whaling Convention uses 6 rule types for monitoring, 4 for opt-outs, 5 for enforcement, and CITES 6, 6, and 3, and then 5, 6, and 3. Not really interesting, I'm just showing it. So they're very similar here in their design as far as using groups of rule types to organize the mechanisms. So diversity is a little bit more interesting because you can clearly see a decline in the number of actors that are being used for monitoring over the regime. So 29 in the Whaling Convention, although we can talk later about that this might be a little bit, there's some context to this. 26 here and then 19 here. And in the wildlife treaties, so CMS and CITES have the highest number of actors that are involved in enforcement, 14 and 7. The Whaling Convention only uses 6, and I can't see how many CBD is using because it's behind the bar, 4. Okay. And then what's really interesting here is the number of actors involved in all 3 MOE aspects. So what is the oversight? Who are the actors that actually have knowledge or have their pies in the pot on all 3 of these aspects or all 3 of these mechanisms? And CMS and CBD is only one actor, and that's the parties. Now, parties might be monitoring themselves, but I would think that you probably want one more entity looking at this. I don't know. That's a question that I'm posing to the group. Then in the Whaling Convention, there's 2, so it's the parties again, but also the commission. And then in CITES, it's the parties, the conference of the parties, so the governing body and the secretariat. Oops. Okay, so moving on to discussions, conclusions, more discussions than conclusions because this is all theory basically. So, so my research question is basically how are monitoring and enforcement mechanisms designed in the 4 treaty regimes? Now, remember, these are the endogenous institutions that are supposed to compensate for a lack of an overarching authority and an external enforcement body. So increased knowledge, but also standardized behavior. So one of the things that the institutional design of the de jure rules showed was the stringency versus implementation flexibility between the Whaling Convention and CITES and then CMS and CBD. So that's an indication that rule compliance and the ability to reach core treaty objectives may be better in the Whaling Convention and CITES because they're more stringent. They have clearer guidance on their parties. And if you look at the institutional statements in CITES and the Whaling Convention, they are pretty specific. Versus this implementation flexibility. Also, some examples would be, for example, specific fishing quotas in the Whaling Convention versus a recommendation to harvest sustainably, or prohibiting trade in species in violation of the convention versus endeavoring to protect endangered species. So these are kind of the comparisons here. So obviously it's going to be easier to follow a specific whaling quota. You can still break it, but at least you have a guidance versus just harvest something sustainably, because that can mean different things to different people. Monitoring mechanisms. So that was kind of interesting that they all use information aggregation and choice rules to configure their MOEs. I don't have anything to compare it to. So if you've looked at policy documents in this regard, and it would be interesting to know if that's something that's standard. It kind of makes sense. You want to share information. You want to outline who's making decisions jointly and what the hierarchy or the reporting structure is. And obviously you want to outline actions. And then enforcement mechanisms. So choice rules dominate in the design of enforcement mechanisms in the 3 UN treaties. While in the Whaling Convention, the focus is on these payoff rules, assigning rewards and benefits, right? But choice rules aren't choice rules. So the choice rules that CITES uses are quite different from those in CMS and CBD. And so in CITES, the choice rules are crafted to specifically outline behavior the parties and national implementation agencies need to engage in. So not allowing trade in certain species unless certain conditions are met, requiring import, export permits. So these choice rules are very specific. In contrast, in the CMS, we have taking of migratory species should not be to the disadvantage of the species. or parties shall regulate or manage biological resources. So what the heck does that mean, and how do I implement that if I'm a policymaker? It's much more vague than the instructions that are given in the other regimes. Looking at robust design features, the Whaling Convention and CITES obviously have the highest number of MOE statements, so redundancy is high. They use a few more rule types to organize the MOEs, so they're more modularity, slightly more, and they use more actors and entities for the MOEs. So theoretically, the institutional design might be more robust, but obviously that's a hypothesis more than a finding. And then opt-outs. So opt-outs are really interesting. CITES really takes the lead on the opt-outs. And the Whaling Convention has some opt-out features, but they focus on special permit whaling. And only one country was doing special permit whaling, that was Japan, and they are no longer a member. So they have reservations and objections, and there are 2 countries that are currently engaging in commercial whaling under objections and reservations. That's Norway and Iceland. Sorry, Christopher. But there's no requirement for them to report their whaling activity. They do it. It's voluntary. They're nice and they report what they're doing, but they could decide tomorrow not to do it. And then there's no way of knowing what the hell they're doing out there. So CMS has no review oversight mechanism at all in place to track anything, not even of their subsidiary agreements. It's a little bit sad. CITES, in contrast, has 2 key review oversight mechanisms that CITES parties filing reservations are recommended to do. The first one is, if they file a reservation, they're required to treat the species under reservation like it is an Appendix 2. So what that means is they need to keep records on trade, and they need to monitor the trade themselves. And then secondly, they have to maintain and communicate these records to the Conference of the Parties with their national reporting. So these are recommendations, but it's a heck of a lot more than the other ones have. And to be fair to CMS and CBD, I should probably mention that CMS and CBD are framework conventions, so they were conceived to be the overarching guide, but the implementation was supposed to be in the CMS through regional agreements, and they have regional agreements, but there aren't any resolutions and nothing in the treaty that mandates any reporting requirements. So it's really, even when you talk to people in the forums, the one complaint that comes up is they have no idea what's going on with these agreements. There's no communication there. And CBD was envisioned to create protocols that deal with biodiversity. It has 2 protocols, but they don't really deal with biodiversity conservation. So again, so you need to consider that when you look at the 4 treaties. All right, so limitations. Well, there's lack of comparison. So there's no other studies that have disassembled international institutions. So for all I know, this is standard practice and nobody's really looked. One big oversight is that constitutive rules are not included. They are, however, really important at the international level. The analysis is limited to focus on monitoring, opt-outs, and enforcement. So there's a lot being left out. And of course, the elephant in the room is that de jure rules do not equal behavior or action. So this is just the rules of the game, but how they're interpreted and implemented is totally different ball of wax. So for the future, what I intend to do is to include constitutive rules in the de jure institutional analysis and also compare those to the perceptions by experts in each forum, and I'm working on that. And I've also applied for an NSF grant to look at assessing treaty implementation in a 5-country comparison. So that would be de jure, de facto, institutional design, and then reported conformance with implementation practices. And I also ideally would like to look at the influence of that in combination on conservation outcomes in those 5 countries. And then finally, I'd really be curious to see how what the institutional design is of other treaties, for instance, the pollution regimes or Ramsar climate and desertification. Okay, so it goes without, I do want to close with a special thank you to Saba Siddiqui for her patience and her mentorship and guidance, and also Jerry Naxam, who's not here, but his legal insights and perspective have also contributed to this work. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions. And I think, I don't know what to do. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Oh, I see claps. Thank you. Any questions? No? No? Ah, Adela.
Hi, Ute. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Over the last few years, as you worked on it as a graduate student, and then, as a postdoc, I've seen parts of it, but it's nice to see sort of this coherent whole, and it really it was really informative for me just to see how much work you did, and really how interesting it is, and really demonstrating, I think, the value of the grammar. And so good job all around. I think a really interesting work. I have a couple of questions. One, I'd like to hear a little bit more about modularity and what you mean by that, because I was thinking of modularity in a different way, sort of like, what shows up in Marco and Marty's work around, I don't know, institutional fit, and that, right, you have pieces that are repetitive and they can be assembled in different ways, and that's sort of modularity, which comes out of some of Lynn's work. I think it's most pronounced in the 2005 Understanding Institutional Diversity, but you seem to be using it in a different way. And so I was wondering if you could spend a little time explaining how you use modularity and what it means.
Yeah, go right to the heart of the issue, right? Adela. So yeah.
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, I was hoping for that question actually, because I am honestly not quite sure. So I did look at modularity, and it is an aspect of polycentricity to a certain degree,
Yeah.
but I kind of used it as looking at the rule types themselves as modules. So each rule type is a module, and then looking at how many rule types they use to craft monitoring. And so what I mean with that is, if you have information aggregation and choice rules, those are three rules that govern monitoring, right? So the thinking here, and it might be flawed, so I'm really appreciative for any feedback, is that, let's say information rules aren't really helping very much in a particular monitoring context. You still have choice rules and aggregation rules that provide some guidance to the parties as to how to monitor. So that's kind of the thinking on modularity. Now, and I know that they're supposed to be semi-autonomous, loosely connected entities from a polycentricity design perspective, but it didn't really translate that way into the formal rule aspect, but I thought it was useful by looking just at the composition of the rule typology. And so, yeah, that's what I did.
Guess that helps to see what your thinking was. Let me ask you another question on this. Why not consider the monitoring mechanism as the module instead of the individual institutional statements? And so you'd have enforcement modules, you'd have monitoring modules, you'd have, whatever other modules you'd want, and they can be mixed and matched and occur at different scales and whatnot. Is I guess that's closer to how I've used it, along with, I see Tommy's here. A shout out to Tommy. And that's how we've used it in our work. So, and I find it interesting because that's pretty much what we have found too, is that you have information rules and choice rules, and sometimes boundary rules saying who can enter this position. But anyway, yeah. I have, if I can, without dominating everything, just one more question. Sure. And it's okay if you don't have an answer to it, but I find it interesting to see the diversity across the different treaties in the design. And so my question to you is why? What do you think is driving that diversity in design?
Well, in part, I think it's the components that I identified. So stringency being one of them is one of the differences.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, you were clear in identifying the differences, but why? Why those differences?
Why?
Yeah, what explains why the whaling treaty is designed one way, but CITES is designed another way?
I have some half-baked, Sapa, plug your ears, please. Some half-baked evolutionary theory on that, where I just think that politically it's become unpalatable to craft newer treaties with mandatory legally binding commitments, which would also explain some of the decision-making in the treaties. So CITES and the Whaling Convention, if there's a listing or something going on with whales, there's no way you're going to get consensus. So it's always voting by, it's always majority voting. And versus the CBD, everything is by consensus. So I like to call the CBD the wordsmithing convention, because they can spend 10 hours on one sentence because it has to be just right for everybody.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that's part of the why, but again,
well, that's interesting. And then I'm going to shut up, everybody. Sorry. That's interesting, because it'd be interesting then to compare treaties that are based on a consensus aggregation rule versus treaties that allow for other types of aggregation rules. And so, you know, climate change has been in the news a lot lately, and that's true of the UNFCCC, and then the Paris Agreement, is that it's all based on consensus.
Yeah,
and so you debate forever, and it is all about wordsmithing, and which is sort of interesting. But okay, anyway, I'll stop there.
But see, these are all the CBD is a cousin to the Climate Convention. It's just the cousin that nobody talks about. They all talk about the climate, but I had delegates say to me, you know, climate change is the icing, but the cake is biodiversity. Without biodiversity, you're toast. But usually policymakers run to the Climate Convention, and that is more funded than the Biodiversity Convention. So yeah, they were designed that way. And actually, the one thing that I got from my interviews is that especially countries that aren't highly developed appreciate this kind of a structure because it gives them power that they do not have in the other ones. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Saba?
Ute, my question follows on Adela's. Is there anything about the nature of the good, so to speak, that might inform the differences in design? So the treaties are focusing on different species, for example. Are there any characteristics of the species, the implications of harvesting different types of species, anything relating to actually the characteristics of what's being regulated that may also, you think, help inform design?
Not that I can really think of. I mean, the CBD is kind of an outlier because they look at biodiversity, also, although they do have some species-related institutional statements in there. But generally, it's commercially valuable species of all types, whales, but you know, CITES also addresses other marine species, and whales are included in CITES too. I'd have to think of that. I mean, I think I've thought about that in the past, but I haven't found a good connection with regard to the good, other than they're all common pool resources, right? I mean, they're rival to a certain degree, although there is non-consumptive use, like whale watching is one that comes to mind, and then also photo safaris. I mean, you don't have to shoot the animal, you can just take a picture, but, and there are issues with that too, but generally it's the over-appropriation of species. That's the main driver, but I have to think on that a little more, I think. It's a good point. Thank you.
Thanks, Ute.
Any other? Tommy? Oh, sorry, I don't know who was first.
Angela was before.
Okay.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Well, I guess first, positive feedback this was great. This is really great. I literally just learned yesterday, like, oh, how do you do analysis with institutional grammar? And then here we go. Like, what a great presentation that explains, like, kind of step by step, a really great way. And again, I apologize for this question, in the sense of like, this is more of an eyeball question. Like, I know you literally mentioned like, this is a limitation, you didn't do it. But again, I also don't know when you did this, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, constitutive rules and everything you did. Just from what you remember when you coded this, or again, it just depends on what, because the constitutive rules is in some way a recent thing. Like, how often did you feel like you saw constitutive rules? And again, I'd be curious to hear just a general hypothesis of what, you'd think if you were to look at them.
I did look at them, and I looked at them in great detail. And as you know from our coding meetings, I'm the constitutive rule queen. So if there's a way to go, I will pick constitutive. They're really important in the treaty context. And it cannot be overstated. The connections between constitutive rules and regulative rules is really an unexplored field that I think my research will contribute to in another paper. This paper has been a labor of love, but it's also been a bane of my existence because it just keeps lingering around. I can't seem to get it published, but anyways, so this feedback is really great. So constitutive rules, to answer your question, are important. They're difficult to code. Now we have the IG 2.0, thanks Christopher and Saba. I did not have that, so I developed a rule typology to look at them. And they are linked, they are crucial to analyzing. Looking at just the monitoring and enforcement mechanisms without considering constitutive rules is not the full picture. It really isn't. Because they're supposed to enforce and monitor the goals and aspirations and the context that's outlined in the constitutive rules. And did you have was there another aspect to that question? Sorry.
No, I was just curious to hear again, like how often you found them or.
Yeah. Well, actually I did do that. So each treaty contains about 75% regulative rules and 25% constitutive rules across all four regimes, which is kind of interesting if you think about the oldest one is over 70 years old and the other one is 30. So, but they all have that mix 75 to 25. Okay, sorry, Tommy.
Great. Well, first of all, yeah, this was really cool, Ute. I'm excited about what you're doing and seeing all the coding you've done. Also, personally, I lived off the coast of Argentina for 9 months, watching southern right whales, jumping right in front of me. So like seeing all the institutions behind this, for me, it's really cool. My question for you is just like more specific and perhaps more detailed, but I'm curious about when you use the number of attributes as your measure of diversity, I'm wondering who the actors are here in these institutional statements. Is it just countries? Are we talking about other organizations? And I wonder if perhaps you could, in an iteration of this paper, right, try to disentangle that a little bit more. It's just like not just counting how many actors are mentioned, but rather what types of actors are involved or are brought into the table here. And the reason this question comes to me is because when you were showing some of the graphs, one of the mechanisms that you were talking about only had one actor, but you said that was the parties, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if perhaps, treating the parties as a single actor, it could yield different results than, trying to disentangle who they mean by the parties, right? So anyways, I just wanted to pick your brain on that, and if you have any thoughts on that, or based on what you've seen about the actors here.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is, the other elephant in the room is when you do these broad sweeping generalizations, there's a lot of details that are important and kind of don't get addressed. And I'm glad you brought up the actors, because remember how the Whaling Convention has 29 actors? Well, I think at least 11 of those actors are in one statement. And so these are basically where they're saying that they recommend studies on whales and whaling activity, and they want these studies to be conducted in collaboration with anybody who's interested. And then they list IGOs, NGOs, researchers, and this whole list of entities that they want to have involved, but it's all just one statement. Versus CITES, where the actor distribution is more targeted and across different levels of monitoring and enforcement. And so the actors generally are parties, and when we're talking about parties, it's one entity, but it's like however members there are, right? And however members are present voting, actually, sometimes for some of these decisions. And so it would be useful to look at that from that perspective, especially with the CMS, which allots a lot more power to NGOs than the other treaties. In the Whaling Convention treats NGOs like children that need to be punished when they say things that they don't like. And not all countries, but there's been some tiffs there. And there are NGOs that are prohibited from participating in the Whaling Convention, specifically have been ousted. Because they said things that the Japanese delegation didn't like. Now Japan is out, maybe they can come back. But yeah, so there's definitely a need to do that. And I apologize for not including that detail. Any other questions? Did that answer your question, Tommy, actually? Okay. Well, we've gone a little bit over time. Oh, Angela, sure.
Yeah, just the last thing, because you're talking about how, oh yeah, you'd see like a bunch of actors in like one statement. I'd be really curious to see like how many, like, we have this conversation about logical combinations and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think I could imagine, like now thinking methodology, when you coded this, you probably just aggregated all the stuff together. So I would love to see what would have happened if, like, and again, we've talked about as a group about like how it's really difficult, to like parse through and whatnot. But hopefully, again, with technological changes and the things that we're working on, I would love to see, what would happen is, okay, let's map out the logical combinations of like each actor and see how that changes, again, how many statements, all this stuff. So again, just a quick comment and curious thing to see.
Yeah, network analysis would probably be good. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much for your feedback.
Thank you, Ute, for the great presentation, and thank you everybody for attending. We will see you in about a month for a presentation by Dan DeCaro.
Yep. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
See you.
Thanks.
Bye, Elke.
Bye.
Bye, Elke.
Was
Thank
great.
you.